The dust from the stagecoach hadn't even settled when Willa Zimmerman saw him for the first time, standing outside the general store with his hat pulled low and his shoulders squared like he was ready to take on the world or walk away from it entirely. It was May 1878, and Paso Robles, California had just begun to bloom with the promise of summer. The small town sat nestled in the rolling hills where cattle ranches stretched for miles, and the railroad had only recently connected them to San Francisco. Willa had returned home after 3 years at a finishing school in Sacramento. Her father's insistence that she become a proper lady finally fulfilled. Reverend Thomas Zimmerman ran the only church in town, a modest white building with a steeple that could be seen from nearly every corner of Paso Robles. He was a good man, stern but fair, and he had raised Willa alone after her mother died, bringing her into the world 20 years ago. The cowboy outside the general store shifted his weight, and Willa found herself staring longer than was appropriate. He was tall, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a jawline shadowed with several days of stubble. His clothes were worn but clean, the kind of practical clothing a man wore when he worked hard for his living. Something about the way he stood, alone but not lonely, caught her attention in a way nothing else had since she had returned home. "Willa, come along now," her father called from the church steps across the street. "We have much to prepare for Sunday's service." She tore her gaze away and gathered her skirts, crossing the dusty main street toward the church. The finishing school had taught her to walk with grace, to speak with refinement, to be everything a preacher's daughter should be. But it hadn't taught her what to do about the flutter in her chest when she glanced back one more time and found the cowboy watching her. His name was Fletcher Hayes, though she wouldn't learn that until 2 days later when he showed up at the church on Sunday morning. He sat in the back pew, his hat resting on his knee, his attention fixed on her father's sermon about redemption and second chances. Willa sat in her usual spot in the front row, trying to focus on her father's words, but she could feel Fletcher's presence like heat from a fire. When the service ended and the congregation filed out into the bright California sunshine, she helped her father greet the parishioners as she always did. "Fine sermon, Reverend," Mrs. Patterson said, fanning herself with her handkerchief. "Though I do think you could have spent more time on the dangers of gambling. My Herbert was at the saloon again last night." "I'll keep that in mind for next week, Mrs. Patterson," her father replied kindly. Willa smiled and nodded at the familiar faces, the families she had known all her life. Then Fletcher stepped forward, and suddenly the world seemed to narrow to just the 3 of them standing in the church doorway. "Reverend Zimmerman," Fletcher said, his voice deep and rough like he didn't use it often. "I wanted to introduce myself. I'm Fletcher Hayes. I just signed on as foreman at the Double R Ranch." Her father shook his hand firmly. "Welcome to Paso Robles, Mr. Hayes. We're always glad to have new members of the community. This is my daughter, Willa." Fletcher turned to her, and up close she could see his eyes were a striking shade of green, like the hills after a rain. "Miss Zimmerman," he said, and the way he said her name made her feel like she was someone worth noticing. "Mr. Hayes," she replied, proud that her voice came out steady. "Welcome to our church." "I hope to be a regular," he said. "It's been a while since I've had a place to worship." Moving around from ranch to ranch doesn't leave much room for routine. "Well, you're always welcome here," her father said warmly. "Where are you from originally?" "Texas, sir, near San Antonio. My family had a small ranch there, but—" Fletcher's jaw tightened slightly. "That was a long time ago. I've been working ranches from Texas to California for the past 8 years." Willa wanted to ask what had happened to his family's ranch, what had sent him wandering, but it wasn't her place. Her father seemed to sense Fletcher's reluctance to discuss the past further and changed the subject. The Double R is a good outfit. John Richardson runs an honest operation. You'll do well there. I appreciate that, sir. Well, I should be going. I promised Mr. Richardson I'd check on the new calves this afternoon. Fletcher nodded to her father, then turned to Willa. It was a pleasure to meet you, Miss Zimmerman. And you, Mr. Hayes. She watched him walk away, his long stride carrying him down the church steps and toward the hitching post where a beautiful black horse waited. He swung into the saddle with easy grace and rode off, leaving Willa standing in the doorway with questions she couldn't ask and feelings she couldn't name. The next few weeks fell into a pattern. Fletcher came to church every Sunday, always sitting in the back, always polite but reserved when he greeted her and her father afterward. Willa found herself looking for him around town, and more often than not, she would catch glimpses of him coming out of the general store or riding past on his way to or from the ranch. Each time their eyes met, he would touch the brim of his hat in greeting, and each time her heart would skip a beat. It was improper, she knew, to think about him so much. Her father had expectations for her, hopes that she would marry a respectable man, perhaps a businessman or even another preacher. A drifting cowboy, no matter how dedicated to his work, wasn't what he had in mind, but Willa couldn't help herself. There was something about Fletcher that drew her, something in the way he listened during the sermons like he was searching for answers, something in the sadness that sometimes flickered across his face when he thought no one was watching. In early June, the church held its annual social, a tradition designed to bring the community together with food, music, and dancing. Willa spent the morning helping set up tables in the yard beside the church, arranging the pies and cakes the townswomen had baked, and hanging lanterns from the trees for when the sun went down. She wore her best dress, a pale blue cotton with white lace at the collar and cuffs, and she told herself it had nothing to do with the possibility that Fletcher might attend. But he did attend, arriving just as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Willa was serving lemonade when she saw him standing at the edge of the gathering, looking uncertain, like he wasn't sure if he belonged. Without thinking, she set down the pitcher and walked over to him. "Mr. Hayes," she said, offering a smile, "I'm glad you came." He looked down at her and something in his expression softened. "Miss Zimmerman, I wasn't sure if I should. These kinds of gatherings aren't really my usual scene." "Everyone is welcome," she assured him. "Have you eaten?" "There's plenty of food." "Not yet. I came straight from the ranch." "Then you must be starving. Come on." She led him to the food tables, aware of the curious glances from some of the townspeople. Fletcher Hayes was still new, still an unknown quantity, and a preacher's daughter showing him such attention would surely fuel the gossip mill. But Willa found she didn't care. She filled a plate for him, piling it high with fried chicken, cornbread, and beans, and handed it to him with a napkin. "Thank you," he said, sounding genuinely touched by the gesture. "You didn't have to do this." "I wanted to," she replied simply. They found a spot under one of the oak trees, away from the main crowd, and Fletcher sat on the ground while Willa settled on a nearby bench. He ate like a man who had worked hard all day, but his manners were good, she noticed. Someone had taught him how to be polite, even if life had roughed him up around the edges. "How are you finding the Double R?" she asked, making conversation. "It's good work. Hard but honest. Mr. Richardson treats his men fairly, which isn't always the case. I've worked for plenty of outfits where the boss thought of his hands as less than human." "That must have been difficult," he shrugged. "It's the way of things for men like me. We go where the work is and we take what we can get, but I'm hoping to stay here a while. This town, it feels different. Feels like somewhere a man could put down roots if he had a mind to." Willa's heart beat faster. "I hope you do stay. Paso Robles needs good people." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "You're very kind, Miss Zimmerman. Your father raised you well." "My father did his best. It couldn't have been easy for him, raising a daughter alone." "I'm sure you made it easier. You seem like the kind of person who brings light wherever she goes." The compliment, delivered so sincerely, made her cheeks warm. Before she could respond, the sound of a fiddle tuning up drew their attention. A makeshift dance floor had been cleared, and people were beginning to pair off for the first dance. Fletcher set his empty plate aside and stood, brushing off his pants. Then, to Willa's surprise, he held out his hand to her. "Would you do me the honor, Miss Zimmerman?" She knew she should hesitate, should consider what people would say, what her father might think. But when she looked up at Fletcher, at the hope and nervousness in his eyes, all those concerns melted away. "I would be delighted, Mr. Hayes." She placed her hand in his, and he led her to the dance floor. His hand settled on her waist, proper and respectful, and she rested her other hand on his shoulder. The fiddle player launched into a lively reel, and suddenly they were spinning, moving together like they had been dancing with each other for years instead of seconds. Fletcher was a surprisingly good dancer, leading her confidently through the steps. "Where did you learn to dance?" she asked, breathless and smiling. "My mother," he said, and for the first time since she had met him, his expression was unguarded, almost happy. She insisted all her children know how, said it was a sign of civilization, even on the frontier. She sounds like a wise woman. The happiness dimmed slightly. She died 6 years ago. Fever took her in the middle of winter. "I'm sorry," Willa said softly. "I lost my mother too. I never knew her, but my father says she would have loved me." "I'm sure she would have. How could she not?" They danced through 2 more songs, and with each step, each turn, Willa felt something building between them, something real and undeniable. Other couples moved around them, but she barely noticed. All she could see was Fletcher, the way the lantern light caught in his eyes, the way he held her like she was something precious. When the music finally slowed and couples began to drift apart, Fletcher walked her back to where her father stood talking with John Richardson. Both men looked up as they approached, and Willa saw her father's eyebrows rise slightly. "Papa, you remember Mr. Hayes from church?" she said quickly. "Of course. Hayes, I see you've been keeping my daughter entertained." There was no censure in her father's voice, but there was a question. Fletcher straightened his shoulders, meeting the Reverend's gaze directly. "Your daughter was kind enough to dance with me, sir. I hope that was appropriate." Her father studied Fletcher for a long moment, and Willa held her breath. Then the Reverend smiled slightly. "My daughter is 20 years old, Mr. Hayes, old enough to choose her own dance partners. I trust you've been a gentleman." "Always, sir," John Richardson chuckled. "Fletcher here is one of the best foremen I've had in years, Reverend. Works harder than any 2 men, and he's got a good head for handling cattle. You could do worse for dance partners, Miss Zimmerman." Willa felt her cheeks heat again, but she smiled. "Thank you, Mr. Richardson." The evening continued, but Fletcher didn't ask her to dance again, though she caught him watching her several times. When it came time for him to leave, he made a point of saying goodbye to her and her father. "Thank you for a lovely evening," he said. "It's been a long time since I felt welcome somewhere." "You're welcome here any time," her father replied. Then, surprisingly, he added, "In fact, why don't you join us for Sunday dinner this week, after church? Willa makes a fine pot roast." Fletcher's eyes widened slightly, then flicked to Willa as if asking for confirmation. She nodded, trying not to smile too broadly. "I would be honored, Reverend. Thank you." After he left, Willa helped clean up the social, her mind spinning. Her father had invited Fletcher to dinner. That meant something, didn't it? That meant her father approved, at least somewhat. Or maybe he wanted to get to know Fletcher better, to determine if he was suitable company for his daughter. That night, lying in bed, Willa stared at the ceiling of her small bedroom and replayed every moment of the evening. The way Fletcher had looked at her, the way his hand had felt on her waist, the way her name sounded in his deep voice. She was falling for him, she realized. Falling fast and hard for a rugged cowboy who had wandered into town with nothing but a horse and the clothes on his back. The question was, did he feel the same way? Sunday seemed to take forever to arrive, but when it finally did, Willa woke with a flutter of nerves in her stomach. She dressed carefully for church, choosing her best Sunday dress in a soft rose color, and she spent extra time pinning up her dark hair. Her father noticed but said nothing, just smiled knowingly over breakfast. The service seemed to drag on forever, though her father's sermon about faith and perseverance was a good one. Fletcher sat in his usual spot in the back, but when he looked at her, there was something different in his eyes, something warmer. After the service, he helped her father shake hands with the departing congregation, and then the three of them walked the short distance to the small house behind the church that served as the parsonage. Willa had prepared the roast the night before, and all it needed was time in the oven. While it cooked, she set the table with her mother's good dishes and tried not to feel nervous about having Fletcher in their home. He seemed nervous too, she noticed, standing awkwardly in the small parlor until her father invited him to sit. "How long have you been working ranches, Fletcher?" her father asked, settling into his favorite chair. "Since I was 18, sir. My father taught me everything about cattle and horses before he died. After we lost the ranch, it was the only skill I had." "What happened to your ranch?" Fletcher's jaw tightened. "Drought, mostly. 3 years of almost no rain. We lost most of our cattle, couldn't pay the bank. They took the land. My mother tried to hold on, but after my father died, she just didn't have it in her anymore. She got sick that winter, and my 2 sisters went to live with our aunt in Houston. I was 20 years old and suddenly responsible for keeping food on the table, so I started hiring on at other ranches." "That must have been difficult," Willa said softly from the doorway to the kitchen. "Losing everything." "It was, but it taught me a lot about what matters. Land, cattle, money, they can all disappear. But family, faith, the work of your hands, that's what endures." Her father nodded approvingly. "Wise words for a young man. How old are you now, if you don't mind my asking?" 26, sir. "And your sisters, how are they?" "They're both married now, living good lives in Texas. I send them money when I can, but they don't need it. Their husbands are good men." The dinner was a success, Willa thought. The roast was tender, the vegetables cooked perfectly, and the conversation flowed easily. Fletcher complimented her cooking multiple times, and she could tell he meant it. He ate with the appreciation of someone who usually took his meals alone or in a bunkhouse with a dozen other men. After dinner, Fletcher insisted on helping clear the dishes, despite her protests that he was a guest. They worked side by side in the small kitchen, and every time their hands brushed, Willa felt that same spark of awareness. "Thank you for inviting me," Fletcher said quietly as he dried a plate. "This is the first home-cooked meal I've had in months. And the first time I've felt like part of a family in longer than that." "You're welcome here anytime," Willa replied, meaning it with all her heart. "My father likes you. That's not something that happens easily. And you." Fletcher set down the dish and turned to face her, his green eyes searching hers. "Do you like me, Willa?" It was the first time he had used her given name, and the intimacy of it made her heart race. They were alone in the kitchen, her father having retired to his study to work on next week's sermon, and suddenly the space between them felt charged with possibility. "Yes," she said simply, honestly. "I like you, Fletcher." He stepped closer, and she could see the pulse beating in his throat, could see the way his hands clenched at his sides like he was fighting the urge to reach for her. "I shouldn't," he said, his voice rough. "I shouldn't like you the way I do. I'm a drifter, Willa. I've got nothing to offer someone like you. You deserve a man with property, with prospects, with a future." "Maybe I don't want that," she said, surprised by her own boldness. "Maybe I want someone honest and hardworking and kind, someone who looks at me like I matter." "You do matter," he said fiercely. "You matter more than anything has in a long time, and that scares me. I came to this town planning to work for a year, save my money, and move on. That's what I always do. But then I saw you, and suddenly the idea of moving on feels impossible." Willa's breath caught. "Then don't move on. Stay, build something here." "It's not that simple." "Why not?" Before he could answer, they heard her father's footsteps in the hallway. Fletcher stepped back quickly, putting proper distance between them, and picked up another dish to dry. When the Reverend appeared in the doorway, they were working quietly, nothing outwardly amiss. "Fletcher, thank you again for coming," her father said. "I hope we'll see you again soon." "Thank you for having me, Reverend. It meant more than you know." Willa walked Fletcher to the door, her father discreetly remaining in his study. On the porch, Fletcher paused, his hat in his hands. "What I said in there," he began, "I meant it. You matter to me, Willa, more than is probably wise given my circumstances." "Then change your circumstances," she said softly. "You said this town feels like somewhere you could put down roots, so do it. Stay." "I want to. God, I want to, but I need time. I need to prove to your father and to you that I'm more than just a drifting cowboy. I need to be worthy of you." "You already are," she said, but he shook his head. "Not yet, but I will be. I promise you that." He left then, riding off on his black horse, and Willa stood on the porch watching until he disappeared from sight. When she went back inside, her father was waiting in the parlor. "He's a good man," the Reverend said without preamble. "I can see it in him, but he's hurting, Willa. He's carrying something heavy, and until he sets it down, he won't be able to move forward." "I know, Papa, but I think I can help him." Her father smiled sadly. "You can't fix people, daughter. They have to fix themselves. But you can stand beside them while they do it if they'll let you." The next few weeks were both wonderful and frustrating. Fletcher came to church every Sunday, and afterward he would often stay for dinner. Sometimes he would help Willa's father with repairs around the church or the parsonage, proving himself handy with a hammer and saw. Other times, he would take walks with Willa, properly chaperoned by distance but not quite by sight of the town's curious eyes. During those walks, Willa learned more about Fletcher. He told her about growing up in Texas, about learning to ride before he could walk, about his father's dreams of building a cattle empire. He spoke of the drought years with pain in his voice, and of the day they lost the ranch with barely contained anger. But he also spoke of beauty, of sunrises over the plains, of the satisfaction of good work done well, of the loyalty of a good horse and the trust of a good dog. "I had a dog once," he told her one evening as they walked along the creek that ran through town. "A blue heeler named Soldier. He was the smartest dog I ever knew. When we lost the ranch, I couldn't take him with me. Had to leave him with the neighbors. That was almost harder than leaving my sisters." "Do you ever think about going back to Texas?" Willa asked. "Sometimes. But there's nothing there for me anymore. My sisters have their own lives, and the land we lost is owned by someone else now. Besides," he paused, looking at her with an intensity that made her shiver, "California has something Texas doesn't." "What's that?" "You." It was moments like that when Willa felt her resolve strengthening. She was falling in love with Fletcher Hayes deeply and irrevocably. And though he hadn't said the words yet, she could see it in his eyes, in the way he looked at her, in the way he found excuses to be near her. He was falling too, but something was holding him back. Some barrier he had built around his heart that kept him from fully committing, from asking for what they both wanted. The answer came in July, on a scorching hot afternoon when Willa was helping her father organize the church library. A stranger rode into town, a man in his 50s with gray hair and a tired face. He hitched his horse outside the church and walked in just as Willa was shelving hymnals. "Excuse me, miss," he said, removing his hat. "I'm looking for Fletcher Hayes." "Someone at the general store said he attends this church." "He does," Willa said, setting down the books. "He works at the Double R Ranch. Is something wrong?" "No, nothing wrong. I have a message for him. My name is Samuel Garrett. I was a friend of his father's." Her father emerged from his office and introductions were made. Samuel Garrett explained that he had been searching for Fletcher for months, tracking him from ranch to ranch across 3 states. "Why?" the Reverend asked, curious but cautious. "Because I have information he needs. About his father's land in Texas. The man who bought it from the bank is willing to sell it back. He's getting old, has no children, and he always felt guilty about how he acquired the property. He's offering it to Fletcher for half what he paid, which amounts to a pittance compared to what it's worth." Willa's heart began to race. "Does Fletcher know about this?" "No, madam. I only just learned of it myself. I promised his father years ago that I'd look after his family if anything happened to him. This is my chance to make good on that promise." They sent word to the ranch, and within an hour, Fletcher arrived at the church, dusty from work and looking concerned. When he saw Samuel Garrett, his face went pale. "Mr. Garrett, what are you doing here?" the older man smiled. "Bringing you news, son. Good news for once." They sat in the church pews while Samuel explained the situation. Willa watched Fletcher's face transform as he listened, saw hope war with disbelief, saw his hands clench and unclench on his knees. "But I don't have that kind of money," Fletcher said when Samuel finished. "Even half price, it's more than I've saved. The bank in San Antonio is willing to give you a loan, based on the value of the land and your family's history. I already spoke to them. You'd have to work hard, Fletcher, but you could rebuild what your father started. You could go home." Fletcher stood abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the dusty street. Willa watched him, her heart in her throat. This was what he had been waiting for, she realized. This was the barrier. He had been holding back because he couldn't offer her anything permanent, couldn't ask her to tie her life to a man with no prospects. But now he had prospects. Now he had a chance at the life he had lost. The only problem was that life was in Texas, and her life was here. "I need to think about this," Fletcher said finally, his voice strained. "Mr. Garrett, can you give me a day?" "Of course, son. I'm staying at the boarding house. Come find me when you're ready to talk." After Samuel left, an awkward silence filled the church. Willa's father excused himself tactfully, leaving her alone with Fletcher. He still stood at the window, his back to her, his shoulders tight with tension. "Fletcher," she said softly, walking up behind him, "this is what you wanted, a chance to go home. Is it?" He turned to face her and she saw anguish in his eyes. "I thought it was. For 6 years, all I've wanted is to get back what I lost. But now I'm not sure anymore." "Why not?" "Because home doesn't feel like Texas anymore. It feels like here. It feels like you." Willa's eyes filled with tears. "Then stay." "I can't ask you to give up your life here," he said roughly. "Your father, your home, everything you know, but I also can't ask you to come with me to Texas. I have no right. We barely know each other." "We know enough," she insisted. "Fletcher, I'm in love with you. I've been in love with you since the first time I saw you, and I think you love me too." "I do," he said, and the words seemed torn from somewhere deep inside him. "God help me, I do. I love you so much it terrifies me, but I don't know what to do." If I stay here, I'm giving up the only chance I'll ever have to reclaim my family's legacy. But if I go to Texas, I'm giving up you." "Not necessarily," Willa said, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. "You could ask me to come with you." "Willa." "Ask me, Fletcher. Ask me to marry you and come with you to Texas. Ask me to help you rebuild your father's dream." He stared at her, breathing hard. "You don't know what you're saying. It would be hard. The ranch is in shambles, the house probably falling down. We'd be starting from nothing, just me and whatever cattle we could afford to buy. You'd be leaving everything comfortable and easy for a life of struggle." "I don't care about easy," she said fiercely. "I care about you. I care about building something together. And I think if you're honest with yourself, that's what you want too." "More than anything," he whispered. Then, slowly, he dropped to one knee right there in the church, taking her hands in his calloused ones. "Willa Zimmerman, I have nothing to offer you but hard work, uncertainty, and a future that might fail as badly as my past did. But I love you with everything I am. I love your kindness and your strength and the way you see the best in everyone. I love the way you make me want to be better, to do better. I know I should wait, should court you properly, should prove myself worthy. But life is short, and chances like this don't come twice. Will you marry me? Will you come with me to Texas and help me build a life there?" Tears were streaming down Willa's face now. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, Fletcher, I'll marry you. I'll go anywhere with you." He surged to his feet and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. She didn't care. She wrapped her arms around his neck and held on, feeling his heart racing against hers, feeling the tension drain from his body as he finally let himself believe this was real. "I'll take care of you," he murmured against her hair. "I swear I'll spend every day making sure you never regret this choice." "I won't regret it," she promised. "I could never regret choosing you." They pulled apart reluctantly when they heard footsteps, and Willa's father appeared in the doorway. He took one look at their faces and smiled. "I take it congratulations are in order, sir," Fletcher said, keeping one arm around Willa. "I've asked your daughter to marry me, and she said yes. I know this is sudden, and I know you might have concerns, but I love her. I'll spend my life proving I'm worthy of her." The Reverend walked forward and studied them both. "Do you know what you're getting into, Willa? Texas is a long way from California." "I know, Papa, but my place is with Fletcher." Her father sighed, but his eyes were kind. "Your mother would have said the same thing. She followed me from Illinois to California without a second thought. I suppose love requires that kind of faith." He held out his hand to Fletcher. "You have my blessing, son. Take care of my daughter." Fletcher shook his hand firmly. "With my life, sir." The next few weeks passed in a blur. Samuel Garrett helped Fletcher arrange the loan and the purchase of the Texas property. Willa and her father began preparing for the wedding, which would take place at the end of August, giving them time to make arrangements, but not so long that Fletcher would miss the fall cattle drive season. The town gossip mill worked overtime. A preacher's daughter marrying a drifting cowboy and moving to Texas was scandalous enough, but the speed of the courtship added fuel to the fire. Willa heard the whispers, saw the looks, but she didn't care. She was too happy, too focused on the future, to worry about what small-minded people thought. Fletcher gave notice at the Double R, and John Richardson, though sorry to lose his best foreman, gave him a generous severance and a glowing letter of recommendation. "If you ever need work in the future, you come back here," Richardson said. "You'll always have a place at the Double R." The wedding took place on a warm August evening, just as the sun began to set. Willa wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved for 20 years, and she carried wildflowers that Fletcher had picked that morning. Her father performed the ceremony, his voice thick with emotion as he pronounced them husband and wife. "You may kiss your bride," he said, and Fletcher cupped Willa's face in his hands and kissed her gently, reverently, like she was something sacred. The whole town turned out for the celebration afterward. There was music and dancing and more food than they could possibly eat. Willa danced with her new husband, with her father, with John Richardson and Samuel Garrett and half the men in town. But it was Fletcher she returned to again and again, Fletcher whose eyes she sought across the crowd, Fletcher whose hand she held as the stars came out. They spent their wedding night in a small room at the boarding house, and Willa discovered that love could be gentle and fierce all at once, that giving yourself to someone completely could feel both terrifying and right. Fletcher held her like she might break, kissed her like he was memorizing every inch of her, and loved her with a tenderness that made her cry. "Are you happy?" he asked afterward, holding her close in the darkness. "Happier than I've ever been," she whispered. "Are you?" "I didn't know I could be this happy. I thought I'd lost the ability when I lost everything else. But you gave it back to me, Willa. You gave me back the ability to hope." They left Paso Robles 3 days later, their belongings packed into a wagon Fletcher had bought with some of his savings. Saying goodbye to her father was the hardest thing Willa had ever done. She clung to him on the church steps, sobbing, while he stroked her hair and murmured reassurances. "You can always come home if you need to," he said, "but I don't think you will. I think you're going to build a wonderful life in Texas. I'm so proud of you, daughter. Your mother would be too." "Come visit us," Willa begged. "Once we're settled, promise me you'll come." "I promise. Now go. Your husband is waiting and you have a long journey ahead." Fletcher helped her into the wagon, and they set off toward the east, toward Texas, toward an uncertain future. Willa looked back once at the only home she had ever known, at her father standing in front of the church with his hand raised in farewell, and then she turned her face forward and didn't look back again. The journey to Texas took 6 weeks. They traveled slowly, camping at night under the stars, sometimes staying in small towns when the weather turned bad. Fletcher taught Willa how to handle the team of horses, how to build a proper campfire, how to read the sky for signs of coming storms. She taught him the songs her father had taught her, and sometimes in the evenings they would sing together while the fire crackled and the night sounds of the prairie surrounded them. It wasn't always easy. There were days when the heat was oppressive, when dust storms forced them to take shelter, when Willa was so saddle-sore she could barely walk. But Fletcher was patient, caring for her when she was tired, making her laugh when she was discouraged. And at night, when he held her in their bedroll under the vast western sky, Willa knew she had made the right choice. They reached San Antonio in early October, and from there, it was only another day's travel to the ranch. Fletcher grew quiet as they approached, his hands tight on the reins. Willa understood. He was about to face his past, to see what had become of his childhood home. The ranch appeared in the late afternoon, sitting in a valley between 2 hills. The house was small and weathered, in need of paint and repairs, but it was still standing. The barn was worse off, with part of the roof collapsed, and the fences had fallen in places. But the land itself was beautiful, rolling grassland that stretched as far as the eye could see. Fletcher stopped the wagon and just stared. Willa saw his throat work, saw his eyes glisten with unshed tears. She reached over and took his hand. "It's still here," she said softly. "Your family's land, your father's dream, and now it's yours again, ours." "There's so much work to do," he said, his voice rough. "Then we'll do it, together." They explored the property, finding the house in better condition than it had appeared from a distance. The furniture was mostly intact, though covered in dust and cobwebs. The well still worked. The barn would need major repairs, but the foundation was solid. "We can do this," Fletcher said, and Willa heard the wonder in his voice. "We can actually make this work." They spent the first few weeks cleaning the house and making it livable. Fletcher worked on the most critical repairs while Willa scrubbed years of neglect from the floors and walls. It was hard work, harder than anything she had done in her sheltered life in Paso Robles, but she threw herself into it with determination. The neighboring ranchers began to stop by, curious about the new owners. Some remembered Fletcher from his childhood, and they welcomed him home. Others were wary of this young couple trying to resurrect a failed ranch. But Fletcher won them over with his knowledge and work ethic, and Willa won them over with her warmth and hospitality. By the time winter arrived, they had the house in good shape, and the barn partially repaired. Fletcher had used the last of their money to buy a small herd of cattle, just 20 head, but it was a start. They would need to make it through the winter, keep the cattle alive, and hope for calves in the spring. Christmas was simple but joyful. Willa decorated their small house with pine branches and berries, and Fletcher surprised her with a gift. A beautiful wooden rocking chair he had made in secret during the evenings, while she thought he was working in the barn. "For when we have children," he said shyly, and Willa's heart swelled with love. "Soon, I hope," she replied, and the way he kissed her then left no doubt that they both wanted the same future. Winter was hard. The money ran out in January, and they had to get by on what they could hunt and the supplies they had put up in the fall. There were days when Willa wondered if they had made a terrible mistake, if they should have stayed in California, where life was comfortable and easy. But then Fletcher would pull her close and tell her he loved her, or she would wake up to find him watching her with such tenderness in his eyes, and she would remember why they had come here. Love. They had come here for love and for the chance to build something together. Spring arrived with a burst of green across the prairie, and more importantly, with 15 healthy calves. Fletcher was ecstatic, talking endlessly about breeding strategies and market prices. He hired on for a few weeks at a neighboring ranch to earn some cash, and Willa managed their small homestead alone, proving to herself and to Fletcher that she was stronger than either of them had known. In May, Willa discovered she was pregnant. She told Fletcher one evening after dinner, watching his face carefully to gauge his reaction. For a moment, he just stared at her. Then he let out a whoop of joy, swept her into his arms, and spun her around the kitchen. "We're having a baby," he kept saying, like he couldn't quite believe it. "We're going to be parents. Are you happy?" Willa asked, though she could see the answer on his face. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it. Willa, you've given me everything. A home, a future, and now a family. I don't know what I did to deserve you, but I thank God for you every single day." The pregnancy was not easy. Willa struggled with sickness in the early months, and as summer's heat arrived, she found the work of maintaining the household increasingly difficult. Fletcher did everything he could to make things easier for her, taking over her chores, insisting she rest, worrying over her constantly. "I'm fine," she would tell him, touched by his concern. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. But you're not just any woman. You're my woman, and I'm not taking any chances." Her father came to visit in July, making the long journey from California to check on his daughter. He arrived with gifts and supplies and an eagerness to see how they were doing. When he saw the ranch, the improvements they had made, the small but growing herd, he smiled with pride. "You've done well," he told them. "Better than I dared hope." He stayed for 3 weeks, helping with repairs and preparing for the baby's arrival. Fletcher and the Reverend worked side by side, and Willa saw the respect growing between them, the relationship deepening into true affection. "You've made my daughter happy," her father told Fletcher one evening while Willa was resting inside. "That's all I ever wanted for her." "She's made me happy too, sir." She's saved me in more ways than I can count. Before I met Willa, I was just drifting, going through the motions of life without really living. She gave me purpose, gave me a reason to put down roots and fight for something. When it came time for her father to leave, Willa cried again, but not as hard as before. She had her own family now, her own life, and while she would always love and miss her father, she no longer needed him in the same way. "Come back when the baby is born," she begged, and he promised he would. The baby arrived in February during a fierce winter storm. The midwife from the nearest town couldn't make it through the snow, so Fletcher delivered his own child with trembling hands and prayers on his lips. It was a boy, healthy and strong, with his father's dark hair and his mother's blue eyes. They named him Thomas after Willa's father, and when Fletcher held his son for the first time, Willa saw tears streaming down his face. "Thank you," he whispered to her, his voice breaking. "Thank you for this, for him, for everything." True to his word, Reverend Zimmerman made the journey to Texas in March to meet his grandson. He baptized baby Thomas in the creek that ran through their property, and he stayed for a month, helping with spring preparations and bonding with his new grandson. "You've built a good life here," he told Willa before he left. "I'm so proud of you, daughter. Your mother would be too." The years that followed were a mixture of hardship and joy. The ranch grew slowly but steadily. Fletcher's reputation as a fair dealer and skilled cattleman spread, and other ranchers began to seek his advice. Willa became known for her kindness, always ready to help a neighbor in need, always offering hospitality to travelers passing through. They had 3 more children: a daughter they named Sarah in 1882, another son named James in 1884, and another daughter named Mary in 1887. Each birth brought fresh joy and fresh challenges. The ranch house expanded with additions Fletcher built himself, and the small herd of 20 cattle grew into hundreds. There were hard times too. A drought in 1886 nearly broke them, forcing Fletcher to sell off part of the herd at a loss. A harsh winter in 1888 killed dozens of cattle and nearly killed James when he wandered away from the house and got lost in the snow. Fletcher found him just in time, and Willa held her shivering son and thanked God for sparing him. But through it all, Fletcher and Willa's love only grew stronger. They worked side by side, building their dream together. On their 10th anniversary, Fletcher took Willa into town and bought her a beautiful gold locket. "I wish I could give you more," he said as he fastened it around her neck. "You deserve silk dresses and fancy parties and a house in the city." "I have everything I want," Willa replied, meaning it absolutely. "I have you and our children and this life we've built. I wouldn't trade it for anything." In 1890, when Thomas turned 11, Fletcher began teaching him the business of ranching in earnest. The boy took to it naturally, showing the same instinct for cattle and horses that his father had. Sarah, at 8, was more interested in books and learning, reminding Willa of herself at that age. James, 6, was adventurous and fearless, constantly worrying his parents with his daring exploits. And little Mary, just 3, was the baby who had everyone wrapped around her tiny finger. Willa's father visited as often as he could, usually once a year, and the children adored their grandfather. He would tell them stories of their mother as a girl, of life in California, of the wider world beyond their Texas ranch. Fletcher was grateful for these visits, knowing how important it was for Willa to maintain that connection to her past. By 1895, 17 years after that first meeting in Paso Robles, the Hayes Ranch was one of the most successful in the region. Fletcher had hired several ranch hands, and they had built a proper bunkhouse for them. The main house had grown into a sprawling, comfortable home, filled with the noise and laughter of 4 children, and the love of two people who had taken a chance on each other. One evening in late spring, after the children were in bed, Fletcher and Willa sat on the porch watching the sunset. It was something they tried to do as often as possible, this quiet moment together at the end of a long day. "Do you ever regret it?" Fletcher asked suddenly. "Leaving California, leaving your father and everything you knew." Willa looked at him, at the man he had become over the years. He was 39 now, with silver beginning to thread through his dark hair and lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. But he was still the rugged cowboy who had captured her heart all those years ago. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single second. This life, our life together, it's more than I ever dreamed of. Even with all the hardships, the droughts and the harsh winters and the times we didn't know if we'd make it, especially because of those things. They made us stronger. They proved that what we have is real, that it can weather any storm." Fletcher pulled her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder. "I love you," he said. "I've said it 1,000 times, but it never feels like enough. You took a chance on a drifting cowboy with nothing to his name, and you never once made me feel like I had to earn your love. You just gave it freely, and that gift changed my life." "And you asked me to stay," Willa replied, referring to that moment in the kitchen in Paso Robles all those years ago. "You could have gone to Texas alone, could have released me from a promise made too quickly, but you wanted me with you. You wanted to build this life together." "I fell harder," Fletcher said softly, echoing words he had spoken many times over the years. "You fell for me, but I fell harder. I fell completely. And asking you to stay, to come with me, to marry me, it was the bravest and best thing I ever did." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun disappeared below the horizon and the stars began to emerge. From inside the house, they could hear the muffled sounds of their children settling down for the night. This was their legacy, Willa thought. Not just the ranch or the cattle or the land, but this family they had created, this love they had built brick by brick, day by day. Thomas would take over the ranch someday, she knew. He had Fletcher's passion for the work and Willa's practical good sense. Sarah would probably become a teacher, given her love of learning. James would likely have some adventure-filled life that would give his parents gray hair. And Mary, sweet Mary, was still too young to know what path she would take, but they would all know love. That was what mattered most. They would grow up in a home where their parents clearly adored each other, where commitment and hard work and faith were valued, where family came first. They would have a foundation that no drought or harsh winter could shake. In 1898, Willa's father suffered a stroke. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday, Willa and Fletcher were on a train to California, leaving the children in the care of trusted neighbors. They made it in time to say goodbye, and Reverend Zimmerman died peacefully, surrounded by love at the age of 72. The funeral was held in the little white church he had served for 40 years, and it seemed like everyone in Paso Robles attended. Willa stood beside Fletcher, drawing strength from his presence as she mourned the loss of her father. After the service, as they were preparing to return to Texas, the church elders approached them with a request. "We know you have your life in Texas," they said, "but we wondered if Reverend Zimmerman's things, his personal effects, could stay with the church, as a memorial." Willa agreed, but she kept her mother's dishes and her father's Bible, precious links to her past. On the train ride home, she cried in Fletcher's arms, grieving not just for her father but for the girl she had been, the innocent preacher's daughter who had fallen in love with a cowboy. "He was so proud of you," Fletcher told her. "Every time he visited, he would tell me how amazed he was by your strength, by the woman you had become. He died knowing you were happy and loved. That's all any parent can hope for." The years continued to pass. Thomas married a rancher's daughter from the neighboring county in 1902, and Fletcher deeded him half the ranch as a wedding present. Sarah went away to school in Austin and returned as a teacher, opening a small schoolhouse on the ranch property for the children in the area. James joined the cavalry and wrote long letters about his adventures that had Willa alternately laughing and crying with worry. Mary grew into a beautiful young woman who, much to everyone's surprise, showed an aptitude for business and began handling the ranch's financial affairs. Through it all, Fletcher and Willa remained the center of their expanding family. Grandchildren arrived, first from Thomas and then from Mary, and the ranch house rang with young voices once more. Fletcher, now in his 50s with more silver than dark in his hair, became a doting grandfather, patient with the little ones in a way that made Willa fall in love with him all over again. On their 30th anniversary in 1908, their children threw them a surprise party, inviting friends and neighbors from all over the county. As Willa stood beside Fletcher, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, their friends and community, she thought back to that day in Paso Robles when she had first seen him. She had fallen for the rugged cowboy who had looked so alone, so lost. But he had fallen harder, had chosen to fight for a future together rather than drift away as he had always done before. He had asked her to stay, to take a chance, to believe in him, and she had said yes. It had been the best decision of her life. "What are you thinking about?" Fletcher asked, pulling her close as people danced and laughed around them. "About that first day I saw you," Willa replied. "Outside the general store in Paso Robles, you looked so alone." "I was alone. I'd been alone for years, and then I saw you, and suddenly I wasn't anymore." "You saved me, Willa. We saved each other," she corrected gently. "You gave me adventure and purpose. I gave you a home and family. We built this life together." "And what a life it's been," Fletcher said, looking around at the celebration. "What a beautiful life." As the party continued into the evening, Willa danced with her husband, with her sons, with her grandsons. She laughed with Sarah and Mary, accepted congratulations from neighbors, and felt overwhelmingly grateful for every moment, every choice, every struggle that had brought her to this place. When the last guest finally left and the house was quiet, Fletcher and Willa returned to their porch, to their spot where they had spent countless evenings over the years. The night was warm and the stars were brilliant overhead. 30 years, Fletcher mused. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I was standing outside that church in Paso Robles, trying to get up the courage to walk through those doors. And sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago. It was a lifetime ago, a whole lifetime that we've lived together. Do you remember what I said to you that day in your father's kitchen, when I told you that you mattered more than anything? I remember everything you've ever said to me, Willa replied. I meant it then, and I mean it now. You matter, Willa. You're the best thing that ever happened to me. Falling in love with you, building this life with you, it's been the greatest adventure of my life. We're not done yet, Willa said with a smile. We still have years ahead of us, more grandchildren to meet, more sunsets to watch, more life to live. Then I can't wait, Fletcher said, kissing her gently. As long as I'm with you, I can't wait to see what comes next. They grew old together, Fletcher and Willa, surrounded by love and family. They saw their children's children grow and thrive, saw the ranch continue to prosper, saw the Wild West they had known slowly transform into something more civilized and modern. But some things never changed. Fletcher's love for Willa, deep and unwavering. Willa's love for Fletcher, the steady foundation of her life. The commitment they had made to each other that day in Paso Robles, standing in her father's church, promising before God and man to love and honor each other all the days of their lives. When Fletcher passed away in 1920 at the age of 68, He died peacefully in his sleep with Willa beside him, as he had been beside her for 42 years. She held his hand and whispered that she loved him, and she liked to think he heard her, even if he couldn't respond. The funeral was the largest the county had ever seen, testament to the life he had lived and the impact he had made. Willa lived another 5 years, spending her days surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, telling stories of the past, of a rugged cowboy who had wandered into her life and changed everything. She spoke of love and courage and faith, of taking chances and building dreams. And when she finally joined Fletcher in 1925, dying quietly one spring morning with Sarah holding her hand, she went with a smile on her face and peace in her heart. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built together, under a sky as wide and blue as the one they had traveled beneath on their journey from California to Texas all those years ago. Their children erected a simple marker that read, Fletcher Hayes and Willa Hayes. Beloved husband and wife. They built a legacy of love, and that legacy lived on in their descendants, in the ranch that continued to thrive, in the stories passed down through generations. The preacher's daughter who had fallen for the rugged cowboy. The cowboy who had fallen harder and asked her to stay. The love story that had begun in a small town in California and had bloomed into something beautiful and enduring in the heart of Texas. Years after their deaths, their great-great-grandchildren would stand on that same porch where Fletcher and Willa had spent so many evenings, and they would feel the love that had built this place. They would hear the stories and understand that what their ancestors had created wasn't just a ranch or a business or a piece of property. It was a testament to the power of love, to the courage it takes to choose someone and commit to them fully, to the beauty of building a life together through good times and bad. The preacher's daughter and the rugged cowboy. Two unlikely people who had found each other against all odds, who had taken a chance on love when it would have been easier and safer to walk away. They had faced droughts and harsh winters, loss and hardship, uncertainty and fear. But they had faced it all together, hand in hand, heart to heart. And in doing so, they had created something that would outlast them both. A family, a legacy, and a love story for the ages.